So it isn't even a good metaphorical beginning. Socrates, another person for whose existence as a real person we don't have any conclusive evidence. He's only described in the work of other people. He didn't write anything or say anything himself that we know about, or we can prove, but it doesn't matter, because if you're an atheist, because no one human being is more divine than any other. But if what is reported of him is true, Socrates would refer to what he called a daemon, to an inner voice, a constant companion to his thoughts, that would warn him if in an argument he was making an unfair point, or stretching the evidence further than it would go, or taking advantage of a weak opponent, that it would, like a gyroscope, inwardly correct him. He once paused apparently in the middle of an argument for about 20 minutes while he worked out if his daemon was telling him that he'd gone too far or not, and went on trial for his life, said in his closing speech that he knew one thing, that nothing he'd said at the trial had met with any inward opposition from his most stern critic. The daemon is the best word for it that I think we have. Adam Smith refers to the sort of the unseen audience, the person who we're always trying to impress, and it's in his theory of moral sentiments. American colloquialism says morality is what you do when nobody's looking, what you think you can get away with, how you judge yourself when you're not going to be judged by anybody else. We all know what we're talking about, and C.S. Lewis makes a huge thing about calling it conscience, and saying therefore it must come from or be the gift of someone else. Well, I don't see why Lewis says that. Isn't it a lot less strenuous to postulate that this is innate to all people who are not psycho or sociopathic, that we want to think well of ourselves, not just be thought well of by other people, and that's just as strong an incentive for behavior as covetousness, lust, the will to power, and other things. And it predates all erections of altars, idols, and gods. So the probability is, it seems to me, that religion gets its morality from us, not the other way around. Thank you. And just to see if I can ram that home, I formulated it as a challenge. And I've done this now in debates with quite senior rabbis and of various congregations and bishops and so forth. It's a simple question. I haven't yet had an answer to it, so I'll put it on the record again. You have to name for me a moral action taken or a moral sentiment uttered by a believer that couldn't be taken or uttered by me as a non-believer. Something that only a believer, a person of faith, could do. I couldn't emulate because I don't have any belief in God. So far, no one's been able to suggest anything under that heading. But there's a corollary question, much briefer, and where you don't have to stay for an answer. You have to think of a wicked thing said or an evil thing done by someone only because they thought God was telling them to do it. Now you've already thought of one, haven't you? Of course you have. And now you've thought of another. And another. Well, I rest my case. The evidence is, from recent measurements of opinion, I'm very distrustful of opinion polls, as a rule, and they tend to ask superficial questions. But the Pew Research Center in the United States has recently done a lot of work on religious allegiance, and what it's found is that the largest growing minority in your southern neighbor is those who check none of the above in the box marked faith. It's double what it was 10 years ago. I would predict it would double again in the next 10 years. It's about 13 to 14% now. These are not atheists, I should say, but they are people who, if you wanted to say what their common and unifying proposition was, would be this. An ethical life can be lived without reference to the supernatural. Simple proposition. And that plus, I think, the desire to defend the Constitution and the idea of a secular republic and the separation of church and state from theocratic bullying, both at home and abroad. People have had enough of being menaced and threatened and lectured and terrified by those who claim to have God on their side, whether it's obviously the forces of jihad or more insidiously and nearer home, those who want to have stultifying nonsense taught to American school children with taxpayers' money. let alone the idea that equal time should go to stultifying nonsense. In other words, after the biology class, we have the intelligent design moment. Don't call it intelligent design, by the way. You've made a concession if you agree to call it that. Call it creationism, we just want to go. So then we have the astronomy period, and then we'll do Mrs. Jenkins will take you for astrology after the break. And then tomorrow we'll have your alchemy papers all ready. It's enough to make a cat laugh, and people won't have it. Nobody wants to come from a state that gets laughed at for that kind of stupidity. And no one's going to hold their convention in the capital city of a state that does it. And it's been defeated now in every court and school board in the land. And I'm proud to say, I think, after battling it for a long time, I've lived to see these people defeated. Not just defeated, but also humiliated, which is very nice. I don't think the religious can have it all ways, you see. I mean, if intercessory prayer, for example, is valid, and if God can be called upon to save, well, let's take the most obvious example, the life of a sick child, and the child recovers, then God has just taken on all the if that happens and is attributable to the intercession, then God has just taken on the responsibility for all the children who don't recover. And the religious get very uneasy when you talk to them like this, because they both do want to say that help is available from on high, but if it's available sometimes, why isn't it available all the time? Why is it so maldistributed? Why is it so random? Why is it so capricious? It only replaces the argument about suffering and evil to where it was in the very first place, which is why the more intelligent religions are very sparing about claiming divine intervention, because they don't want to arouse too great a demand for it. Now, you may be asking the wrong person in that when I hear a lot of this stuff, it's white noise to me. If someone dear to me had died, well, this has happened to me, as a matter of fact. If someone comes up to me and says, well, at least they're in a better place now, I don't even remember to be insulted, really. Though I could take offense, I think, at such a fatuous thing being said to me uninvited. But what I can't understand is why I can't put myself in the position of someone who'd be pleased and comforted to hear that. I just can't. I'm really sorry. Nor can I imagine myself saying it to someone who'd suffered a real loss. I can't imagine the expression I'd have to put on my face to say such a thing. So, maybe I'm not the ideal person to put this question to. Well, Daniel Dennett, who's by way of a sort of colleague of mine in this cause, he has written a wonderful book called Breaking the Spell, which I recommend to you. Possibly available at fine bookstores everywhere, as mine is, by the way, here. And in it he says that belief in belief, as he puts it, may very well have salutary effects or have had them. For example, this is not very controversial, but it's a good example. In the days when there was no germ theory of disease, and when, for example, quite senior divines like Timothy Dwight, the founder of Yale, condemned smallpox vaccination because it was an interference with God's design, which presumably it is, if he designed the smallpox virus. Nonetheless, if you were an ignorant fool and you went to the witch doctor ceremony to be lectured by another cynical ignorant fool, you still might have a better chance of recovery, because everybody knows that morale and optimism does play an X factor role in good health. So there may well be benefits to, or have been benefits to belief, but I think that we, if I can speak so conceitedly, Eurocentrically perhaps, but have reached the point where that's long ago hit diminishing returns. That really the emancipation of the mind requires us to put that sort of thing behind us. The reason why there's a gulf fixed between me and a believer, and also why I have difficulty understanding quite